The joint military exercise designated Pacific Guardian commenced on a clear morning in March 2019 as naval vessels from the United States and Australia assembled in the Coral Sea, approximately 300 kilometers east of Cairns, and among those vessels was a contingent of American assessment officers, whose presence went largely unnoticed amid the routine pageantry of Allied cooperation. The exercise involved 12 Australian ships, including 3 Hobart-class air warfare destroyers that represented the most advanced vessels in the Royal Australian Navy, 8 Anzac-class frigates that formed the backbone of the surface fleet, and the amphibious assault ship HMAS Canberra that was the pride of Australia's power projection capability. The American contingent included 2 Arleigh Burke-class destroyers, a Ticonderoga-class cruiser, and an attached logistics vessel, along with 40 personnel from the U.S. Navy's Operational Test and Evaluation Force, whose official role was described as observing the exercise for training purposes. In reality, these 40 specialists represented the most comprehensive assessment of Allied naval capabilities that the U.S. Navy had conducted since the Cold War, invited by Australian defense leadership who were increasingly concerned that decades of budget constraints and procurement compromises had created vulnerabilities that peacetime exercises never adequately tested. The decision to request this unprecedented American assessment had emerged from growing anxiety within Australia's defense establishment about whether the nation's military capabilities matched the rhetoric that politicians deployed when discussing regional security and national defense. Australia had spent over $40 billion between 2010 and 2019 upgrading naval capabilities with new destroyers, frigates, and support vessels that were described in press releases and parliamentary speeches as providing world-class air defense and anti-submarine warfare capability. The Hobart-class destroyers in particular were promoted as among the most advanced air warfare vessels in the world, equipped with the Aegis combat system used by the U.S. Navy and armed with SM-2 surface-to-air missiles that could supposedly defend against aircraft, anti-ship missiles, and even ballistic missiles. But senior officers who understood modern naval warfare had become increasingly worried that these impressive specifications masked critical vulnerabilities that would be exposed immediately if Australia ever faced a serious adversary. Rather than conducting exercises against simulated threats designed to demonstrate success rather than reveal weakness, the assessment methodology employed by the American team was designed to test Australian capabilities against realistic scenarios rather than the scripted exercises that typically characterize joint training operations, and the scenarios chosen reflected emerging threats that Australia might actually face rather than Cold War assumptions that were increasingly obsolete. The assessment would simulate a sustained conflict with a hypothetical adversary possessing capabilities comparable to what China's People's Liberation Army, Navy, and Air Force had demonstrated in recent years modern. Anti-ship cruise missiles launched from aircraft, surface vessels, and submarines, advanced air superiority fighters operating with sophisticated electronic warfare support, long-range maritime strike aircraft capable of attacking from hundreds of kilometers away, and coordinated saturation attacks designed to overwhelm defensive systems through sheer volume rather than relying on stealth or surprise. The Australian ships would defend against these simulated attacks using their actual defensive systems, real missile inventories, and authentic command and control procedures, rather than the simplified exercises, where attacks came one at a time, and where Australian forces always knew when and from where threats would emerge. The first scenario tested on the second day of the exercise involved defending the Australian task force against a simulated air attack by 12 aircraft launching anti-ship missiles from maximum range, a relatively modest threat compared to what a serious adversary could generate, but sufficient to begin exposing the vulnerabilities that would later dominate the assessment report. The attack simulation began when American EA-18G Growler electronic warfare aircraft began jamming Australian radar systems using techniques that replicated Chinese electronic warfare capabilities, degrading but not completely eliminating the Australian ship's ability to detect incoming threats. Then FA-18 Super Hornets from the USS Ronald Reagan, which was participating in the exercise, approached from multiple vectors at low altitude, launching AGM-84 Harpoon anti-ship missiles that were tracked as simulated threats by both American and Australian assessment systems. The Australian destroyers responded exactly as their doctrine required, launching SM-2 missiles to intercept the incoming harpoons while using their phalanx close-in weapon systems as last-ditch defense against any missiles that penetrated the outer defense layer. The engagement was judged a tactical success with 11 of 12 simulated missiles destroyed before reaching their targets, a result that would have generated positive headlines if publicly reported. But the American assessment officers documented details that transformed apparent success into evidence of catastrophic vulnerability when scenarios were extended beyond single engagements to sustained operations that realistic conflicts would require. The Australian task force had expended 26 SM-2 missiles, destroying 11 simulated incoming missiles, a ratio reflecting the reality that intercepting modern anti-ship missiles required multiple defensive missiles because single-shot kill probability was far lower than promotional material suggested. More critically, the exercise revealed that the 3 Hobart-class destroyers collectively carried only 48 SM-2 missiles total, meaning the first simulated attack had consumed over half their defensive missile inventory. At this expenditure rate, the Australian destroyers could defend against perhaps 2 more attacks of similar scale before exhausting their anti-aircraft missiles completely, after which they would be defenseless against any air threats. The assessment officers noted that in realistic combat scenarios, adversaries would not launch 12 missiles and then politely wait while defenders replenish their stocks, but would instead launch sustained attacks specifically designed to deplete defensive missiles and overwhelm systems once inventories were exhausted. The second scenario, executed on the 3rd day of the exercise, tested Australian responses to saturation attacks, where the number of incoming threats exceeded the defensive system's ability to engage them simultaneously, revealing vulnerabilities that were even more disturbing than the missile inventory limitations. The simulated attack involved 36 anti-ship missiles approaching from multiple directions simultaneously, launched from a combination of aircraft, surface vessels, and submarines to replicate the coordinated strikes that modern adversaries could execute using networked command and control systems. The American assessment team had carefully calculated that 36 simultaneous threats represented the approximate threshold where the Australian task force's combined defensive capacity would be overwhelmed based on the number of fire control channels the ships possessed and the rate at which they could launch defensive missiles. The results confirmed these calculations with devastating clarity. The Australian ships managed to engage 23 of the 36 incoming missiles, but 13 simulated missiles reached their targets unopposed, scoring killing hits on all 3 Hobart-class destroyers and 2 frigates. In a real engagement, the Australian task force would have been effectively destroyed within minutes of the attack commencing. The underlying technical limitations that made Australian ships vulnerable to saturation attacks reflected procurement decisions and budget constraints that had prioritized acquiring expensive platforms over ensuring those platforms possessed the weapons and systems needed for sustained combat operations. Each Hobart-class destroyer had cost over $3 billion and featured impressive capabilities, including the Aegis radar system that could track hundreds of targets simultaneously, and the command and control systems that could coordinate defensive responses with great sophistication. But these ships were equipped with only a single missile launcher capable of firing 1 SM-2 defensive missile every few seconds, meaning each destroyer could engage perhaps 8 to 10 targets during the brief period when incoming missiles were within intercept range. A single American Ticonderoga-class cruiser possessed more simultaneous engagement capacity than all 3 Australian destroyers combined, because American ships carried more launchers and larger missile inventories that reflected realistic combat requirements rather than peacetime budget limitations. The Australian ships looked formidable and performed well in exercises designed to showcase their capabilities, but they lacked the depth of capability needed to survive against adversaries who would exploit these limitations ruthlessly. The electronic warfare assessments conducted throughout the exercise revealed another dimension of vulnerability that was potentially more dangerous than missile inventory limitations because it could render even adequate stockpiles useless if ships could not effectively detect and track targets. Modern naval combat depends absolutely on radar and communication systems that can be disrupted or deceived by electronic warfare capabilities that have advanced dramatically in recent decades, and the exercise simulations demonstrated that Australian ships were alarmingly vulnerable to electronic attack. When American EA-18G Growlers employed their full electronic warfare capabilities against Australian radars, the degradation was so severe that Australian ships frequently could not detect incoming threats until they were within ranges where successful intercepts were unlikely. The Australian destroyers' Aegis systems were sophisticated but were designed decades earlier when electronic warfare threats were less advanced and the ships lacked modern electronic warfare suites that could counter the jamming and deception techniques that potential adversaries had developed. The assessment team noted that in realistic combat scenarios, Australian ships would likely face electronic warfare attacks far more intensive than what the American aircraft had employed during the exercise, potentially rendering the expensive radars and missiles nearly useless. The air superiority portion of the assessment examined how long Australian ships could maintain effective defense against sustained air attacks by modern fighters, and the conclusions were even more alarming than the anti-missile defense results because they suggested that Australia's entire maritime defense strategy rested on assumptions that were demonstrably false. Australian naval doctrine assumed that the Royal Australian Air Force would maintain air superiority over any region where Australian naval forces operated, preventing enemy aircraft from approaching close enough to threaten surface ships and reducing the defensive burden on the ships themselves. But wargaming conducted during the assessment demonstrated that against adversaries with modern air forces operating from land bases relatively close to contested waters, Australian air forces would be unable to maintain air superiority beyond perhaps the first day of conflict. Australia's 65 FA-18 fighters and 12 F-35 seconds were capable aircraft but were vastly outnumbered by potential adversaries, and once Australian airfields were suppressed by missile attacks, the surviving aircraft would be unable to generate the sortie rates necessary to contest airspace over maritime approaches. Without air cover, Australian surface ships would face continuous attack by enemy aircraft that could launch anti-ship missiles from beyond the range of the ship's defensive systems. The cumulative impact of all vulnerabilities identified during the assessment led to the report's devastating central conclusion that in sustained combat against a peer adversary, the Royal Australian Navy would lose effective air defense capability within 48 hours and be forced to withdraw from contested waters or face catastrophic losses. The assessment calculated that a serious adversary attacking Australian naval forces would likely commence operations with massive missile strikes against Australian airfields to suppress Air Force operations, followed immediately by coordinated attacks on surface ships using aircraft, submarines, and surface vessels, launching saturation attacks specifically designed to exhaust defensive missile inventories. Within 24 hours, Australian destroyers and frigates would have expended most of their anti-aircraft missiles defending against these initial attacks, and without Air Force protection and with depleted missile stocks, the ships would become increasingly vulnerable to follow-on strikes. By 48 hours, the surviving ships would have essentially no anti-aircraft capability remaining and would face a choice between withdrawing from contested waters or remaining and being destroyed by attacks they could no longer defend against. This timeline was not theoretical speculation, but rather the logical conclusion of analyzing Australian capabilities against realistic threat scenarios using the actual performance data collected during the exercise. The classified briefing where American assessment team leaders presented their findings to Australian defense officials took place in Canberra 3 weeks after the exercise concluded, and the atmosphere in the secure conference room reflected the gravity of conclusions that contradicted decades of official narratives about Australian naval capabilities. The American team leader, Rear Admiral James Mitchell, had spent 35 years in the Navy, including multiple combat deployments, and had supervised assessments of Allied forces throughout Asia and Europe, giving him credibility that made his observations impossible to dismiss as uninformed criticism. Mitchell began the briefing by acknowledging the professionalism and competence of Australian naval personnel, noting that individual ship crews had performed well during the exercises and that the problems identified were not failures of training or dedication, but rather reflected systemic issues of procurement priorities, inadequate funding, and unrealistic assumptions about how modern naval warfare would unfold. Then he proceeded through the assessment's findings methodically, using data collected during the exercise to demonstrate each vulnerability and showing through wargaming how those vulnerabilities would be exploited by competent adversaries. The Australian defense officials receiving the briefing represented the highest levels of military and civilian defense leadership and included the Chief of the Defense Force, the Chief of Navy, senior officers from all services, and defense ministry officials responsible for capability, development, and procurement. Their reactions to Mitchell's presentation ranged from defensive resistance to shocked acknowledgement, depending on whether individuals had previously suspected these vulnerabilities or had believed the optimistic assessments that characterized official capability reviews. Some officers challenged specific findings, arguing that the exercise scenarios were unrealistic or that Australian capabilities had not been properly demonstrated during the simulations. But Mitchell methodically addressed each objection using data that was difficult to dispute, and gradually even the skeptics were forced to acknowledge that the assessment had revealed genuine vulnerabilities that could not be dismissed through better training or minor improvements. By the briefing's end, the room had settled into stunned silence as officials absorbed implications of findings that suggested Australia's maritime defense strategy required fundamental rethinking rather than incremental adjustments. The political sensitivity of the assessment's conclusions created immediate tensions between military officers who wanted to use the findings to justify increased defense spending and government officials who feared that publicizing vulnerabilities would undermine public confidence and create political problems for the administration. The report was classified at the highest levels, with distribution restricted to fewer than 30 people, preventing even most defense officials from accessing the full findings. Official statements about the Pacific Guardian exercise emphasized the success of Allied cooperation and the valuable training that both forces had received, carefully avoiding any mention of the assessment or its disturbing conclusions. Behind closed doors, intense debates erupted about whether the assessment's findings were accurate, whether making the recommended changes was fiscally possible, and how to address vulnerabilities without creating public panic or providing intelligence to potential adversaries about specific weaknesses. Some officials argued that the assessment was too pessimistic and that realistic conflicts would not involve the sustained high-intensity operations that the scenarios assumed. Others insisted that the vulnerabilities were real and that failing to address them would leave Australia genuinely defenseless if serious conflicts emerged. The strategic implications of the assessment extended far beyond technical questions about missile inventories and radar capabilities to fundamental issues of whether Australia could defend itself independently or whether the nation's security depended entirely on American military support in ways that official rhetoric carefully avoided acknowledging. Australian defense policy had long maintained that the nation possessed credible independent defense capabilities that could deter aggression and defend Australian territory and maritime approaches even without Allied support, though this claim had always been somewhat aspirational. The assessment's findings suggested that this independence was largely illusory and that in any serious conflict, Australian forces would require immediate American support to avoid being overwhelmed within days. This dependency was politically sensitive because it contradicted the national self-image of Australia as a capable middle power that controlled its own security, and because it raised uncomfortable questions about whether Australia's foreign policy could ever truly be independent when the nation's defense relied so completely on American military power. The debates within Australian defense circles about how to respond to the assessment's findings revealed deep divisions about priorities, realistic threat assessments, and whether Australia faced genuine security challenges or whether the vulnerabilities identified were theoretical problems unlikely to manifest in actual conflicts. Some officials argued that the report overstated risks by assuming worst-case scenarios where Australia faced peer adversaries in high-intensity conflicts, when realistic threats involved lower-level contingencies that Australian forces could handle adequately. They noted that Australia had not faced serious military threats for decades, and that spending billions to address vulnerabilities identified in extreme scenarios was unnecessary when those funds were needed for other priorities. Other officials insisted that the report's scenarios were not extreme, but rather reflected emerging realities of regional military developments, particularly China's rapidly expanding naval and air forces that were specifically designed to contest maritime approaches in ways that would exploit exactly the vulnerabilities the assessment had identified. They argued that dismissing the findings as overly pessimistic would leave Australia dangerously unprepared if conflicts materialized. The technical solutions that the assessment recommended for addressing identified vulnerabilities would require sustained investment over more than a decade and would cost tens of billions of dollars that Australia's defense budget could not easily accommodate without either massive increases or dramatic cuts to other capabilities. The most critical recommendations involved increasing missile inventories to levels that could sustain operations through extended conflicts, rather than being exhausted after initial engagements, requiring Australia to purchase hundreds of additional anti-aircraft missiles at costs exceeding $3 billion. The report recommended upgrading electronic warfare capabilities across the entire surface fleet, installing modern systems that could counter advanced jamming and deception techniques, at estimated cost of another $2 billion. It suggested that Australia needed additional destroyers beyond the 3 currently in service to provide adequate air defense coverage for the fleet and maritime approaches, potentially requiring purchasing 3 more vessels at $9 billion. Most fundamentally, it recommended that Australia needed to expand Air Force capabilities substantially to ensure that naval forces would have the air superiority coverage that doctrine assumed, requiring additional fighters and supporting aircraft at costs that could exceed $20 billion over 15 years. The procurement challenges that addressing these vulnerabilities would create were complicated by Australia's defense acquisition system that was notorious for delays, cost overruns, and political interference that prevented optimal capability development. Previous major naval projects, including the Hobart-class destroyers and Anzac-class frigates, had experienced costs that substantially exceeded original budgets and schedules that stretched years beyond planned delivery dates, suggesting that any major new acquisition programs would face similar challenges. The recommendations to purchase additional missiles, upgrade electronic warfare systems, and acquire new platforms would require navigating the same bureaucratic and political obstacles that had created the current vulnerabilities, raising questions about whether the problems could actually be solved given the system that had generated them. Some defense officials argued that trying to match peer adversaries ship for ship and missile for missile was financially impossible, and that Australia needed entirely different strategies that leveraged advantages in other domains rather than competing in areas where adversaries possessed overwhelming numerical superiority. The alternative strategic approaches that some analysts proposed in response to the assessment involved acknowledging that Australia could not maintain naval forces capable of defeating peer adversaries in conventional surface combat, should instead focus on asymmetric capabilities that could impose costs without requiring matching adversary strengths. These proposals suggested investing heavily in submarines that could threaten adversary surface ships without being vulnerable to the air attacks that would devastate Australian surface vessels, shifting resources from vulnerable destroyers and frigates to expanding the submarine fleet. They recommended developing long-range anti-ship missiles that could be fired from land bases, aircraft, or small, fast attack craft, creating distributed threats that would be difficult to suppress and that could impose risks on adversary forces without concentrating Australian assets in vulnerable surface ships. They proposed that Australia should focus on denying adversaries the ability to use maritime approaches, rather than attempting to control those approaches with surface fleets that could not survive against superior forces. These asymmetric approaches were strategically sound but politically difficult because they required acknowledging that Australia could not field the impressive surface fleets that provided visible symbols of national power. The regional security implications of Australia's naval vulnerabilities extended beyond questions of national defense to affect alliance relationships and the broader balance of power throughout the Indo-Pacific region. The assessment's findings became known to other regional powers through intelligence channels and diplomatic discussions, affecting perceptions of Australia's role as a middle power that could contribute meaningfully to regional security. Nations that had viewed Australia as a capable partner whose naval forces added substance to regional security architecture were forced to downgrade their assessments of what Australia could actually contribute to collective defense scenarios. Potential adversaries gained confidence from understanding that Australian naval forces could be neutralized relatively easily, reducing whatever deterrent effect those forces might have provided. Most significantly, the revelations reinforced perceptions that American military power was the only credible counterweight to emerging threats in the region, and that nations like Australia were essentially dependent on American protection, regardless of their own military investments. The American perspective on Australia's vulnerabilities was complicated by conflicting interests in having capable allies who could share burdens, versus maintaining the dependency that ensured allies remained aligned with American strategic priorities, U.S. defense planners genuinely wanted Australia to address the identified vulnerabilities because more capable Australian forces would reduce demands on overstretched American military resources and would make regional security arrangements more credible and sustainable. But some American officials privately acknowledged that Australia's dependency on American military support ensured that Australia would remain a reliable ally whose foreign policy would never substantially deviate from American positions on critical issues. Building truly independent Australian defense capabilities might create possibilities for Australia to pursue foreign policy approaches that diverge from American preferences, reducing American influence over a strategically important ally. This tension between wanting capable allies and preferring dependent partners was rarely discussed publicly but influenced American approaches to supporting allied capability development. The broader context of Australia's naval vulnerabilities reflected global trends in military technology and economics that were making effective defense increasingly expensive and creating growing gaps between what nations could afford and what modern threats required. The cost of defensive missiles had increased dramatically relative to the cost of offensive missiles, creating mathematics that heavily favored attackers who could launch large numbers of relatively inexpensive weapons to overwhelm expensive defensive systems. Modern air defense required integrating sensors, command systems, electronic warfare capabilities, and weapons in ways that multiplied costs, while adversaries could achieve effective attacks through simpler systems that exploited specific vulnerabilities. Small wealthy nations like Australia faced particular challenges maintaining credible military forces because they lacked the economies of scale that made defense spending efficient for larger nations, and because they could not match the industrial capacity that peer competitors possessed. These trends suggested that Australia's vulnerabilities were not simply products of poor decisions, but reflected structural challenges that would be difficult to overcome regardless of spending levels. The evolution of Chinese military capabilities during the years following the assessment validated the report's warnings and demonstrated that the scenarios used to evaluate Australian readiness were not theoretical exercises, but realistic representations of threats that were materializing rapidly. China's People's Liberation Army Navy commissioned over 30 major surface combatants between 2019 and 2024, expanding its fleet to sizes that dwarfed regional competitors including Australia and creating quantitative advantages that would overwhelm Australian defenses through sheer numbers even if qualitative capabilities were comparable. The PLA Air Force deployed hundreds of modern fighters to bases that could reach Australia's maritime approaches, creating air superiority challenges far beyond what Australian air defenses could handle. Most significantly, China demonstrated anti-ship ballistic missiles and hypersonic weapons that could attack surface ships from ranges exceeding 1,000 kilometers, making even Australian waters potentially contestable from Chinese territory, and rendering obsolete the assumptions that geographic distance provided security. The threats that the 2019 assessment had evaluated were not future possibilities, but present realities that were advancing faster than Australian procurement systems could respond. The public discussions about Australian defense capabilities remain largely disconnected from the classified realities that the assessment had revealed, with political rhetoric continuing to describe Australian forces as world-class and fully capable, despite internal acknowledgement of serious vulnerabilities. Government ministers regularly announced defense spending increases and new acquisitions while carefully avoiding specifics about whether current capabilities could achieve the missions that official doctrine claimed Australian forces could perform. Defense white papers described regional security challenges in abstract terms that avoided confronting the specific scenarios where Australian forces would be inadequate, and media coverage of naval acquisitions and exercises emphasized impressive technologies and successful demonstrations without examining whether those capabilities would suffice in realistic conflicts. This disconnect between public narratives and classified realities was not unique to Australia, but reflected common patterns in democratic nations where full transparency about military vulnerabilities would be politically damaging and potentially operationally dangerous by revealing weaknesses to adversaries. The personnel consequences of the assessment's findings created morale challenges for naval officers who had dedicated careers to developing capabilities that were now revealed as inadequate for the missions they were supposedly designed to perform. Officers who had commanded the Hobart-class destroyers and who had believed they were operating world-class platforms discovered that their ship's vulnerabilities would likely result in their loss within days of serious conflict commencing. Sailors who had trained intensively on defensive systems learned that no amount of training could overcome the mathematical realities of limited missile inventories and insufficient engagement capacity against saturation attacks. The cognitive dissonance between the pride that personnel felt in their service and the assessment's conclusions that their efforts would be insufficient created psychological burdens that defense leadership struggled to address. Some officers became vocal advocates for the procurement changes needed to address vulnerabilities, while others grew cynical about whether political leadership would ever provide the resources necessary for genuine capabilities rather than impressive-looking platforms that could not perform their missions. The fiscal reality confronting Australia was that simultaneously addressing the naval vulnerabilities identified in the assessment, maintaining existing force structure, and funding other defense priorities would require increasing defense spending to levels that were politically unsustainable absent dramatic shifts in threat perceptions or national priorities. Australia's defense budget in 2019 represented approximately 2% of GDP, roughly $60 billion annually, with naval forces consuming about $15 billion of that total. The recommended changes to address air defense vulnerabilities alone would require additional annual expenditures exceeding $5 billion sustained over more than a decade, representing increases that would push defense spending toward 3% of GDP. Such increases would require either accepting dramatically higher budget deficits, cutting other government programs substantially, or raising taxes significantly, all political non-starters absent genuine crisis that created public support for major defense investment. The result was a strategic paralysis where everyone acknowledged problems, but nobody could identify politically viable solutions. The incremental improvements that Australia actually implemented in response to the assessment represented efforts to address the most critical vulnerabilities within available budgets, though defense officials privately acknowledged that these measures were inadequate to fundamentally change the operational conclusions. The Navy purchased additional SM-2 missiles, increasing inventory from 48 to 72 per destroyer, improving sustainability but still leaving forces vulnerable to exhaustion during sustained combat. Electronic warfare upgrades were funded but scaled back from comprehensive modernization to targeted improvements on the most vulnerable systems, reducing but not eliminating susceptibility to jamming and deception. Plans for additional destroyers were deferred indefinitely because fiscal constraints and competing priorities made the $9 billion acquisition unaffordable in any realistic budget scenario. The result was that 5 years after the assessment, Australian naval capabilities had improved marginally but remained fundamentally challenged by the same vulnerabilities that had produced the 48-hour timeline in the original evaluation. The pandemic that began in 2020 created additional complications for Australian defense planning by consuming government resources and attention, while simultaneously accelerating geopolitical tensions that made the assessment's warnings more urgent and relevant. COVID-19 required massive government spending on health responses and economic support that absorbed funds that might have been available for defense, making the already difficult fiscal choices even more constrained. Simultaneously, the pandemic accelerated tensions between Australia and China over issues including pandemic origins, trade disputes, and regional security, creating exactly the kind of geopolitical environment where naval vulnerabilities could become operationally relevant rather than theoretical concerns. Chinese military activities near Australian maritime approaches increased in frequency and assertiveness during 2020 and 2021, testing Australian responses and demonstrating capabilities that validated the assessment scenarios. Yet Australia's ability to respond to these developments remained constrained by the same vulnerabilities that had been identified years earlier and that remained largely unaddressed. The AUKUS agreement announced in 2021 represented Australia's most significant response to the strategic challenges that the assessment had illuminated, though the nuclear submarine acquisition at the agreement's core would not address immediate vulnerabilities and would create new fiscal pressures that could worsen near-term readiness. The agreement between Australia, United Kingdom, and United States to provide Australia with nuclear-powered submarines acknowledged that Australia needed capabilities that could operate in contested environments where surface vessels were increasingly vulnerable, validating the assessment's conclusions about surface fleet limitations. But the submarines would not be delivered until the 2042 at earliest, leaving a 2-decade gap where Australia's naval vulnerabilities would persist. Moreover, the estimated cost of the nuclear submarines exceeded $300 billion over the program's lifetime, consuming resources that could otherwise fund the missile inventories, electronic warfare upgrades, and additional surface vessels that could address near-term vulnerabilities. The agreement was strategically sound for Australia's long-term security, but did little to solve the problems that the assessment had identified and that remained urgent concerns. The debate within the Australian strategic community about whether the assessment's 48-hour timeline was accurate or whether it represented worst-case analysis that overstated vulnerabilities continued years after the original evaluation, reflecting genuine uncertainty about how conflicts would unfold and disagreement about appropriate planning assumptions. Critics of the assessment argued that it assumed adversaries would execute flawless, coordinated attacks that might not be achievable in reality, that it underestimated the effectiveness of Australian defenses and the difficulty of targeting ships at sea, and that it ignored possibilities for Australian forces to mitigate vulnerabilities through tactical adaptations and operational creativity. Defenders of the assessment insisted that military planning required preparing for capable adversaries who would exploit vulnerabilities ruthlessly, that assuming enemies would perform poorly was the path to catastrophic surprise, and that the scenarios used were, if anything, conservative compared to what modern militaries could achieve using their full capabilities. Resolution of this debate was impossible without actual combat that would test the competing theories, but the stakes of being wrong in either direction were enormous. The lessons that other middle powers drew from Australia's experience reflected growing recognition that modern military capabilities were becoming unaffordable for any nation except superpowers, and that traditional approaches to national defense were becoming obsolete in an era of exponentially advancing military technology. Nations throughout Asia, Europe, and elsewhere faced similar challenges of maintaining credible defense forces when the cost of effective systems were increasing faster than defense budgets, and when adversaries could potentially overwhelm defenses through quantitative advantages that smaller nations could never match. Some nations responded by embracing asymmetric approaches that avoided competing directly with larger powers, focusing on guerrilla strategies, insurgency capabilities, and civilian resistance rather than conventional forces. Others doubled down on alliance relationships, accepting increased dependency on major powers in exchange for protection that they could not provide independently. A few pursued nuclear weapons as the only credible deterrent that smaller nations could afford against larger adversaries. Each approach involved accepting limitations and vulnerabilities that challenged traditional notions of national sovereignty and independence. The technological trends that would shape naval warfare's future suggested that the vulnerabilities identified in the 2019 assessment would intensify rather than diminish, creating even greater challenges for nations attempting to maintain effective naval forces. Hypersonic missiles that could strike ships at speeds exceeding 5 times the speed of sound were approaching operational deployment, creating threats that existing defensive systems could not intercept, and that would make surface vessels extraordinarily vulnerable regardless of their defensive capabilities. Autonomous underwater vehicles and drones would proliferate, creating new forms of attack that would be difficult to detect and defend against. Directed energy weapons, including lasers, might eventually provide cost-effective missile defense, but those technologies remained years from operational deployment and would require substantial investment. Most fundamentally, the integration of artificial intelligence into targeting systems would enable adversaries to coordinate attacks with precision and scale that would overwhelm any defensive systems that humans could operate manually. The trajectory was clear. Surface naval warfare was becoming increasingly lethal and expensive in ways that favored nations with deep resources and industrial capacity. The existential questions that Australia's naval vulnerabilities raised about the nation's strategic future and its role in an increasingly contested region remained unresolved and perhaps unresolvable given the constraints of geography, population, economic capacity, and alliance relationships. Australia was a nation of 25 million people occupying a continent that required defending, bordered by ocean approaches that potential adversaries could contest, located in a region where the dominant military power was explicitly challenging the security architecture that had provided stability for decades. Australia's economic capacity could not support military forces capable of independently deterring or defeating determined aggression by peer adversaries, yet complete dependency on allies for security-constrained foreign policy autonomy and created vulnerabilities if alliance relationships ever faltered. The assessment had revealed that decades of defense investment had purchased capabilities that looked impressive but could not perform their fundamental missions, but the costs of acquiring capabilities that could survive modern conflicts exceeded what Australia could afford, and alternative strategies that accepted fundamental limitations challenged the nation's self-image and political viability. The story of the 2019 U.S. Navy assessment of Australian naval capabilities is ultimately about the collision between comfortable assumptions and uncomfortable realities, between the forces that nations want to believe they possess and the capabilities they actually have when tested against realistic scenarios. It is about how billions of dollars in procurement can create platforms that are technologically sophisticated but operationally inadequate because they lack the depth of capability needed for sustained combat rather than peacetime. Demonstrations. It is about the mathematics of modern warfare, where defensive missiles cost millions while offensive missiles cost hundreds of thousands, creating economic advantages for attackers that make effective defense prohibitively expensive for all but the wealthiest nations. Most fundamentally, it is about the difficult choices that middle powers face in an era when maintaining credible independent defense capabilities is becoming unaffordable, forcing nations to accept either increased dependency on powerful allies, pursuit of asymmetric strategies that abandon conventional military competition, or acceptance of vulnerabilities that challenge national sovereignty and security. The 48-hour timeline was not merely a technical assessment of missile inventories and engagement capacity, but rather a stark measurement of how quickly the comfortable fictions that sustained Australian defense policy would collapse when confronted with the realities of modern conflict, and how little time would be available to recognize errors and adapt before catastrophic consequences materialized. The assessment was a warning that was impossible to ignore, even if addressing it proved beyond Australia's capacity to afford.